Imagine 200 people in their finest clothes standing in a desolate sun-scorched field where a celebration should be, staring at a void where a wedding was promised. That was the trap my mother set for me, a public execution of my dignity planned down to the very last flower petal. She didn't just want to stop the wedding. She wanted to witness the exact moment my spirit broke in front of everyone I loved. But there is a specific kind of silence that follows a predator who thinks they've already won, and in that silence, I found a weapon she never saw coming. My name is Vera Westbrook. I am 28 years old, and for most of those years, I lived as an extension of my mother's shadow. They say a mother's love is a sanctuary, but what do you call it when that sanctuary has bars on the windows? It started 8 months ago, on a Tuesday that felt entirely ordinary until it became the most important night of my life. My partner, Nathan, didn't choose a Michelin star restaurant or a choreographed public spectacle. He simply stood in our cramped kitchen in Ridge Hill, Georgia, surrounded by the smell of pine sawdust from his workshop and the low hum of our aging refrigerator. He held a ring he had spent 7 months of overtime to afford, his voice thick with a vulnerability I had never heard before. He told me he didn't have a grand speech, only the certainty that he wanted every one of his tomorrows to begin with me. I didn't let him finish the sentence before I was in his arms, crying a kind of relief that felt like coming home after a long war. We sat on the linoleum floor together, leaning against the cabinets, watching the small diamond catch the overhead light. For 11 minutes, the universe was perfectly aligned. Then, the vibration of my phone on the counter shattered the peace. It was her. I answered with a smile still stretching my face, ready to share the joy. But my mother didn't offer a congratulatory gasp or a tearful blessing. Her first words were a clinical interrogation. "Where is the venue, Vera? I need the location immediately." I glanced at Nathan, whose brow furrowed in confusion. I told her he had literally just asked me, that we hadn't even stood up from the floor yet. It didn't matter. She told me these things book a year in advance, and that she would be handling the logistics. You see, since my father passed away when I was 19, my mother had installed a specific kind of psychological software in my mind. At his funeral, she had whispered that it was just the two of us now, that I was her entire world. From that moment on, saying no to her didn't just feel like a disagreement, it felt like I was abandoning a grieving widow to the cold. Have you ever realized that your kindness was actually a cage built by someone else's hands? When I tried to gently suggest we wanted to plan this ourselves, the silence on the other end lasted exactly 4 seconds. It was a heavy, calculated silence. Then she spoke with a flat, martyr-like tone. "Fine, I understand. You don't need me anymore." The guilt flared up instantly, a hot, familiar sting in my chest. I folded. I told her I did need her. I heard her exhale, a sound of pure victory, and Nathan watched me from across the room with a jaw so tight I thought it might snap. I didn't realize then that the wedding was never the goal for her. The goal was the reclamation of her property. Over the next 3 months, the takeover happened with the slow, inevitable creep of rising floodwaters. It started with helpful phone calls to florists because I was busy teaching my 3rd graders. Then, it escalated to her attending cake tastings without me, and eventually changing the primary contact number on every account to her own. I had dreamed of a wild, messy aesthetic, sunflowers, lavender, and the smell of the earth. My mother swept those aside for bleached white roses, claiming they represented elegance, a word she used as a shield against my personality. She vetoed my desire for a casual barbecue feast, telling me people would talk if we served pulled pork at a wedding. When I tried to push back, the waterworks began. She would dab her eyes with a tissue she seemingly kept ready at all times, invoking my father's ghost to justify her control. Nathan began to pull away into his workshop, spending hours sanding wood in a silence that felt like a warning. My best friend and maid of honor, Rachel, watched this erosion of my will with a quiet, simmering fury. One evening, after watching my mother rearrange my centerpiece samples for the 3rd time, Rachel pulled me aside at the door. She didn't argue or scream. She just gripped my forearm and told me to trust her, her eyes reflecting a cold certainty I didn't understand. Why is it that the people who love us most can see the trap long before we even realize we're walking into it? The psychological warfare turned toxic 2 months before the date. My mother invited Nathan to a private lunch framed as a family bonding session. When he returned, he didn't look bonded. He looked like he had been through an interrogation. He sat me down and told me, with a voice as steady as stone, that my mother had described me as damaged goods. She had dug up a period of deep depression I had experienced in college following my father's death, a time when I struggled to leave my bed for weeks, and presented it to my future husband as a warning. She asked him if he was truly prepared to handle someone as volatile as me. Something in my soul fractured in that moment. That dark stretch wasn't a secret, but it was a sacred part of my healing, and she had turned it into a weapon of war. When Nathan told her he didn't see damage, only a survivor, she had left her tea unfinished and walked out. Minutes later, she was on my phone, screaming that Nathan was isolating me, that he was a blue-collar carpenter with no ambition who didn't deserve a Westbrook. I stood in my kitchen, caught between the woman who gave me life and the man who gave me a future, feeling like I was being torn in two by the weight of her expectations. Then the rumors began to circulate through the veins of our small town. Ridge Hill is the kind of place where a secret is just a story that hasn't reached the post office yet. I'd walk into the hair salon or the grocery store and feel the atmosphere shift. People stopped asking me about the guest list and started asking me if I was getting enough rest. I saw the pity in their eyes, a thick, suffocating layer of it. My mother was seeding the community with the narrative that I was having a mental collapse, that Nathan was an opportunist, and that the wedding was a tragedy in the making. A text arrived from Rachel. Do not react to anything she does this week. Trust me. Scared means you're paying attention. The financial reality of a wedding is a cold, hard master. Nathan and I had scraped together $18,000 over 3 years. Years of skipped meals, used cars, and extra shifts. Every cent was tied up in contracts with a 30-day cancellation window. We were officially inside that window when my mother decided to play her final hand. 7 days before the ceremony, on a Monday morning that should have been filled with final fittings and excitement, I called the florist to confirm the delivery time for the sunflowers Rachel had secretly helped me sneak back onto the list. The woman on the other end was silent for a beat too long. "Ma'am," she said, her voice dripping with awkward sympathy. "That order was terminated 3 days ago. Your mother called and said the wedding was off." My heart didn't just skip. It felt like it stopped beating entirely. I hung up and dialed the caterer. Same answer. The venue? Mrs. Westbrook called and informed us the family had decided to cancel due to unforeseen circumstances. I felt the floor beneath my desk at the school dissolve. I called her, my fingers trembling so violently I nearly dropped the phone. She picked up instantly, her voice smooth and devoid of any guilt. "I canceled a mistake, Vera," she said. When I told her it wasn't her choice, she hit me with the line that severed our bond forever. "Everything about you is my decision. I raised you. I buried your father alone. This wedding is mine to give or take." I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I just said, "No, it isn't," and hung up. I sat in my empty classroom while my students were at recess, staring at the wreckage of 3 years of dreams. Have you ever felt the exact moment a version of yourself dies so a stronger one can be born? I drove home in a trance. I found Nathan in the kitchen, and for the first time, I didn't try to hide the truth. I told him everything. He didn't flinch. He just sat on the floor with me, his rough carpenter's hand holding mine while the refrigerator hummed in the silence. We were broke. We had no venue. We had no food. We had 200 people expecting a celebration in a week. But then, Nathan's phone rang. It was Rachel. He put her on speaker. "Don't call the vendors," she commanded. "Don't call your mother. I need 48 hours. Insurance is already in place." That night, my mother made her final mistake. She called Nathan at nearly 11 p.m., not realizing he had already hit the record button. She spent 20 minutes dismantling my character, calling me psychologically fragile, telling him I would ruin his life, and begging him to walk away while he still could. She sounded like a savior, but the recording captured the truth. She sounded like a jailer losing her favorite prisoner. 48 hours later, Rachel arrived at our door with a manila folder so thick it looked like a legal brief. She sat us down and revealed a secret she'd been keeping for 6 months. The day my mother had volunteered to take over the wedding, Rachel had seen the writing on the wall. She knew my mother's history of sabotaging my milestones from my graduation to my first job offer. So, using her own savings as a deposit, Rachel had secretly booked a backup venue, a private garden estate called Elmwood, owned by a close friend. She had also secured a separate florist, a different caterer who specialized in the barbecue I actually wanted, and a photographer who was in on the secret. "I didn't do this because I hate her," Rachel said, her voice cracking for the first time. "I did this because I love you, and I promised your father I would never let her shrink you again." The plan was a tactical masterpiece. We would let my mother believe she had won. We would let her think the vendors were cancelled and the wedding was dead. Then, on the morning of the ceremony, Rachel would activate a mass contact system she had built for all 200 guests. The message would be simple. The venue has been upgraded. A surprise for the bride and groom. Please arrive at Elmwood Garden instead of the original lot. And my mother? I asked. Rachel's eyes turned to cold flint. She gets the original address. Only the original address. I didn't sleep for the next 4 days. I felt like a spy in my own life. I watched my mother's Facebook posts, the ones where she asked for prayers for her daughter's health and claimed the wedding was off due to medical advice. It was a lie so profound it actually made me feel nauseous, but I followed Rachel's orders. I remained silent. I didn't negotiate. I didn't plead. I realized then that when you argue with a narcissist, you're just giving them more fuel. Silence is the only thing they can't use against you. Desire whispers louder than guilt. I kept repeating that to myself as I looked at the ivory dress hidden in Rachel's guest room. 2 days before the ceremony, my mother actually showed up at my school again, trying to stage a scene in front of my principal about my instability. I walked past her without a word, my heart hammering against my ribs, but my face a mask of calm. I had already asked my Uncle Tom, my father's brother, to walk me down the aisle. When I told him the truth, he had wept and told me my father would have been the first one to help me change the locks. The morning of the wedding arrived with a clarity that felt like a bell ringing in a cold room. While I was putting on my lace sleeves at Rachel's house, her phone was a beehive of activity. Confirmed. 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 197 guests had received the update. They were told it was a secret upgrade and to keep it off social media until the ceremony started. The community of Ridge Hill, the very people my mother had tried to turn against me, stepped up in a way I never expected. They were tired of her drama too. At 2:30 p.m., the Elmwood Garden estate began to fill. It was everything I had ever wanted. There were wild sunflowers everywhere, their yellow faces turned toward the Georgia sun. The smell of slow-smoked brisket drifted on the breeze. Nathan had even spent his secret weekends building every single chair for the ceremony, 200 handcrafted wooden seats he had labored over in silence so I would have a place to rest. Can you imagine the depth of a love that builds a foundation while the rest of the world is trying to tear the roof down? I stood at the edge of the garden, tucked behind a trellis, and watched as the people my mother tried to manipulate walked through the gates. They weren't looking for a fragile girl. They were looking for a celebration. Rachel had even arranged for a local news crew to be there, framing it as a community love story about a best friend saving a wedding. It was the ultimate insurance policy. If my mother tried to cause a scene later, she would be doing it on camera. At precisely 3:00 p.m., 12 miles away, my mother pulled her silver sedan into the gravel lot of the original venue. She stepped out in her best navy blue dress, wearing a smile of quiet triumph. She expected to see a graveyard of a wedding, empty chairs, a crying daughter, and the absolute proof that nothing happened without her permission. She waited. 5 minutes, 10. The sun beat down on the empty field. No cars arrived. No guests appeared. She pulled out her phone and began a frantic cycle of calls. I know this because later, we saw the call logs. She called me. Voicemail. She called Nathan. Voicemail. She called Rachel, Gloria, Uncle Tom, her own neighbors. Every single person in her life had their phone turned off or was busy cheering as I stepped onto the grass at Elmwood. She was standing in the middle of a literal void, a ghost in a field of her own making. The silence she had tried to impose on my life had finally turned back and swallowed her whole. At Elmwood, the music began, a soft, finger-picked guitar melody. I took Uncle Tom's arm, and as we walked toward Nathan, I didn't feel like a victim. I didn't feel like damaged goods. I felt like a woman who had finally claimed her own name. When we reached the altar, Nathan took my hands, his eyes wet with a pride that made me feel invincible. We didn't use the traditional vows my mother had pre-approved. I looked him in the eye and promised to never let another person's fear dictate the boundaries of our joy. The applause that followed our kiss wasn't just for a marriage, it was for an escape. But the story wasn't over. Around 3:45 p.m., a silver sedan roared up the drive of Elmwood Garden. My mother had finally figured out where we were. She burst out of the car, her face a mask of rage and confusion, and marched toward the gate. But Rachel had prepared for this too. A tall, calm security guard, a friend of the venue owner, met her at the entrance with a clipboard. "I'm the mother of the bride," she screamed, her voice cutting through the soft music of the reception. The guard looked down at his list, took a long, deliberate pause and looked her in the eye. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Your name is not on the guest list. I cannot let you in." She was 20 feet away from the celebration. She could see the fairy lights. She could see me laughing with a glass of sweet tea in my hand. She could see the news camera recording her every move. She tried to push past him, but he was a wall of polite iron. For the first time in 28 years, she was the outsider. She was the one looking through the bars of a sanctuary she didn't own. Loneliness makes dangerous choices feel reasonable, but that day she had to face the most dangerous choice of all, the choice to be alone rather than to be kind. She stood there for 10 minutes, watching her daughter be happy without her permission until the weight of the cameras and the staring guests became too much. She turned around, got back into her car and drove away. The rest of the night was a blur of barbecue, dancing on the grass, and the kind of laughter that stays in your bones for years. We didn't get a refund for everything, but we got back $7,000 after the vendors saw the evidence of her impersonating me. More importantly, Nathan's furniture business exploded after the wedding. People saw the chairs he had built and realized they wanted that kind of soul in their own homes. I sent her a letter a week later. I didn't use it to attack her. I told her I loved her, but that the door to my life now opened from the inside. I told her that if she ever wanted to see me again, it would be in a therapist's office, and only after she admitted to the town that she had lied about my health. It was the hardest thing I've ever written, but as I licked the envelope, I realized I wasn't shaking anymore. 6 months have passed since that day. My mother has started therapy. She went twice, quit, and then went back again. She sent me a pressed wildflower last week, a black-eyed Susan, the same kind from my bouquet. There was no note. Maybe it's an apology, or maybe it's just a white flag. I'm not ready to call her yet, and that's okay. For the first time, okay is enough. Boundaries are the highest form of self-love. I hope you remember that the next time someone tries to tell you that your life belongs to them. If you've ever had to build a garden in the middle of a wasteland someone else created, I want you to know that your sunflowers will grow. You just have to be the one who plants them. If this journey resonates with you, or if you've ever had to stand your ground against someone who claimed to love you while they were trying to break you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep telling stories that remind us we aren't alone in the dark. And before you go, I've linked a story about a woman who discovered her mother-in-law was secretly recording her for 2 years. It's a masterclass in how to handle a toxic relative. Would you like me to tell you more about how Nathan and I rebuilt our finances after the wedding, or should we dive into Rachel's next big move?